The town of Covenant Creek did not give its charity freely. It gave with the weight of judgment, a stone for every crumb of bread. For Anya, whose parents had been taken by the fever that spring, the town's charity was a sliver of barren land at the edge of the settlement. It was a patch of cracked earth and sun-scorched rock, notable only for the one thing that made it utterly useless, a wide, stone-lined well, dug a generation ago and abandoned when it had yielded nothing but mineral-choked seep. The council, led by the stern George Sheriff Brody, had declared it a fair exchange for the forgiveness of her family's debts. They took the fertile acre, the small but sturdy cabin, and the barn. They left her the dust and the hole. She was 18, alone, and stood before them with a quietness they mistook for weakness. The public ledger was squared. Anya was given her deed, the paper a crisp insult in her hand, while the townsfolk watched with the kind of pity that feels sharper than scorn. Her inheritance amounted to a few chickens, a small flock of hardy ducks her mother had prized, a threadbare quilt, and a leather-bound journal filled with her father's intricate, spidery script. He had not been a farmer by trade, but a man who studied the earth itself, a reader of stone and soil. His knowledge had always seemed an abstraction to the pragmatic people of Covenant Creek, a strange and unprofitable hobby. Now, that journal and the useless well were all she had. They expected her to fail. They expected her to come crawling back to the church for alms, or to leave on the next supply run, another ghost flushed out by the harsh realities of the frontier. They watched as she moved her few possessions to the desolate plot, her silhouette small against the vast, indifferent sky. Anya did not weep or plead. She worked. Her first days on the plot were a silent ritual of observation. She did not look at the parched surface of her land, but into the deep, dark mouth of the well. The sun beat down on the plains, turning the very air into a shimmering haze, but a cool, damp breath rose from the stone cylinder. It was a different world down there. The air smelled of wet rock and something ancient, like the scent of a cave opened for the first time in 1,000 years. She would lie on her stomach, her face over the edge, and just listen. There was no echo of splashing water, only a profound, resonant silence. The townsfolk saw her, a solitary figure communing with a dry hole, and the whispers began. Mr. Hemlock, the proprietor of the general store and a man whose opinions were as solid as his sacks of flour, declared it a sign of grief-addled madness. The poor girl's lost her senses, he'd say to customers, shaking his head. Staring into an empty pit as if it holds the answers to her prayers, but Anya wasn't praying. She was remembering. She was remembering her father, his hands dusty with rock samples, explaining that the world beneath their feet was not a dead thing. It had currents, temperatures, and secrets. That night, by the light of a single tallow lamp, she opened his journal. The pages were filled with geological maps of the region, notes on strata, and observations that meant little to most. But one entry, dated 5 years prior, stopped her. The deep well on the north parcel is a failure for water, as predicted. The vein it struck is too deep, the mineral content too high for irrigation. But it is a thermal curiosity. It breathes. The stone draws warmth from the Earth's deep engine, a constant, subtle heat. Even in the harshest winter, the air 20 feet down will not freeze. A stable lung in a volatile body, he had seen a geological anomaly. Anya saw a sanctuary. A plan, audacious and born of desperation, began to form in her mind. It was a foolish-looking hope, one she knew would invite ridicule, but it was anchored in her father's quiet science. The ducks. Her mother's flock was her only asset of any real value, a source of rich eggs and meat. But winter was coming. The plains' winters were brutal, sudden things. The icy winds and deep freezes would halt egg production in every coop in town. The birds would huddle, miserable, consuming precious feed while offering nothing in return until the spring thaw. Unless they could be convinced that winter never arrived. The well wasn't a tomb, it was a refuge. It was a place shielded from the wind, insulated by the earth, and warmed by that deep, planetary breath her father had written about. She would build their coop at the bottom of the well. The work was grueling, a testament to the endurance of a body fueled by little more than hope. She spent a week rigging a pulley system over the well's opening, using a sturdy crossbeam and all the rope she owned. Then, painstakingly, she began lowering supplies into the darkness. Bucket by bucket, she sent down rich soil from the creek bed, mixing it with straw to create a thick, insulating floor. She lowered her mother's nesting boxes, carefully packed with soft hay. She sent down a trough for water, which she would have to haul and lower daily, and a feeder for their grain. The labor stretched her thin. Her hands became raw, her muscles screaming with a constant, fiery ache. The town watched the bizarre spectacle with growing alarm and mockery. The sight of the young orphan lowering dirt into a dry well was the most pitiful, most absurd thing they had ever witnessed. It confirmed every suspicion they had about her fragile state of mind. The day she moved the ducks was the day the town's silent judgment became a spoken verdict. She caught each bird, their squawks of protest echoing strangely in the open air, and placed them gently into a large wicker basket. One by one, she lowered them into the dark, vertical sanctuary. Mr. Hemlock marched out to her plot, his face a mask of righteous indignation. "Anya, what in God's name are you doing?" he demanded, his voice carrying across the dusty ground. "You can't put ducks in a hole. They need sunlight, they need a pond to swim in. This is cruelty. You're burying them alive." Anya paused, her hand on the rope, the basket swaying gently over the abyss. She looked at him, her gaze clear and steady. "They will be warmer there than in any coop in this town, Mr. Hemlock. They will be safe from the wind." Her quiet certainty only infuriated him more. He saw it not as confidence, but as the stubbornness of the deluded. Later that afternoon, Sheriff Brody paid her a visit. He stood with his hands on his hips, his shadow long and imposing. "This has to stop," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "It's an unnatural thing. People are talking. They're saying it's a waste of good animals, that you're not fit to care for them." "They are my animals," she replied, her voice soft but not yielding. "And my land," the sheriff grunted, gesturing at the barren plot. "This isn't land, it's a punishment. Don't make it worse for yourself, girl. Bring those birds up before the first freeze claims them." She did not. She continued her work, her quiet defiance a stone against which their logic and their pity broke. The children of the town invented a new game, daring each other to run to the edge of the well and listen for the ghost ducks. Her isolation was now complete. She was no longer just the orphan, she was the mad girl of the well. Autumn bled into the grey stillness of late fall. The cottonwood trees along the creek dropped their last brittle leaves, and the air grew a sharp, crystalline edge. The first hard frost silvered the ground each morning, and a thin sheet of ice began to form over the town's water troughs. In every other coop, the chickens and ducks were molting, their bodies preparing for the long, lean months ahead. Egg baskets began coming back empty. It was the natural order of things, the expected seasonal retreat. Anya, however, felt a cold knot of uncertainty tighten in her stomach. Every day, she faithfully lowered water and grain into the well. She would call down to her flock, and their contented quacks would echo up to her, a muffled, subterranean sound. But when she lowered the wicker basket to check the nesting boxes, it always came up empty. Days turned into a week, then two. The mockery from the town grew sharper, laced now with a grim, knowing satisfaction. They had told her so. They had warned her. Her foolishness was bearing its inevitable, barren fruit. She began to doubt herself, her father's words, the very earth beneath her feet. Had she misinterpreted his scientific notes, transforming a geological curiosity into a desperate fantasy? The journal had spoken of warmth, but perhaps it wasn't enough. Perhaps the darkness, the confinement, had undone the benefits of the stable temperature. She imagined the ducks huddled below, confused and miserable, their natural rhythms completely broken. The weight of her failure felt as deep and as dark as the well itself. Each empty basket she pulled up was another piece of evidence against her, a confirmation of her own delusion. She was just a foolish, grieving girl, playing out a strange fantasy on a patch of worthless land. The town was right. The world was as harsh and as simple as they believed it to be. The well, however, was a world unto itself, governed by principles older than Covenant Creek. What the town saw as a grave, a dark and unnatural prison, was in fact a perfect geothermal incubator. 40 feet below the surface, the biting prairie winds had no purchase. The brutal, daily temperature swings that shocked the systems of surface-dwelling animals were smoothed into irrelevance. The stone walls, which plunged deep into the earth, acted as a massive, passive radiator. They soaked up the planet's constant, gentle interior heat, the slow, deep furnace of the world, and released it into the enclosed column of air. While the temperature on the surface might plummet from a cool afternoon to 10 degrees below freezing after sunset, the air at the bottom of the well remained in a perpetual state of mild, overcast autumn. It never froze. It never even came close. The light was dim, a soft, filtered glow from the circle of sky far above, mimicking the short, placid days of early spring. This unique combination of stable temperature, lack of wind, and consistent, low light was a powerful deception. It tricked the ducks' biology. Their bodies, shielded from every environmental cue of an approaching winter, did not receive the signal to shut down. They continued to feed, to fatten, and to produce. The deep earth was lying to them, telling them a gentle, life-giving story in the face of the harsh truth raging on the surface. Anya's father had understood the principle. Anya, in her desperation, had trusted it. And deep in the quiet, insulated darkness, the first egg was laid. It sat in the straw, a perfect, pale oval, a secret kept between the ducks and the deep earth. Then the blizzard came. It was not a gentle snow, but a blue norther, a storm of legend that swept down from the frozen plains with shocking speed and ferocity. The sky turned a bruised, slate gray, and the temperature dropped 30 degrees in a single hour. A wall of blinding white descended upon Covenant Creek, and a savage wind began to howl, a physical force that rattled cabins and stripped the last vestiges of warmth from the world. For 2 days, it raged. The snow piled into deep, impassable drifts, and the cold was a merciless, invasive killer. It found its way through every chink in every wall, every crack in every foundation. The town hunkered down, burning through firewood at an alarming rate, the residents prisoners in their own homes. When the storm finally broke, the world was a changed place. It was silent, beautiful, and utterly lethal. The sun shone weakly on a landscape of sculpted white, but the air was so cold it felt like inhaling tiny shards of metal. The true cost of the storm was revealed slowly. Sheriff Brody lost his entire flock of chickens, frozen solid in their coop despite his best efforts to insulate it. Mr. Hemlock discovered his prized geese, huddled together in a futile quest for warmth, were now just frozen statues in the snow. Throughout the town, the story was the same. The blizzard had been too sudden, too severe. The livestock that had survived were gaunt and frostbitten. The town's supply of fresh food was gone. There would be no more eggs until spring, and the preserved meat and flour in their larders suddenly seemed frighteningly finite. The community, once so certain and self-sufficient, was now facing a long, hungry winter. Fear, cold and sharp as the air itself, began to settle over Covenant Creek. The desperation grew with each passing day. The children were pale, the adults short-tempered and worried. The communal feeling of the town had curdled into one of shared anxiety. It was Mr. Hemlock who broke first. His store, usually a place of abundance, was now a monument to their predicament. The shelves were beginning to look sparse, and he had no fresh goods to offer. He thought of the orphan girl and her buried ducks, an image that had once been a source of derisive amusement. Now, a sliver of impossible hope pricked at him. It was absurd, a fool's errand, but they were in a fool's predicament. He gathered Sheriff Brody and 2 other townsmen. They did not speak as they walked through the deep snow, their boots crunching in the profound silence. The journey to Anya's plot felt like a pilgrimage of shame. They found her clearing a path to the well, her breath pluming in the frigid air. She watched them approach, her expression unreadable. There was no triumph in her eyes, no hint of "I told you so." She simply waited. Mr. Hemlock stopped a few feet from her, his hat in his hands, his usual bluster completely gone. He couldn't quite meet her gaze. "Anya," he began, his voice raspy. "The town. We've lost nearly everything. The chickens, the geese. There are no eggs." He finally looked up, his eyes pleading. "We were wrong to mock you. We were wondering. Your ducks. Are they? He couldn't finish the sentence. The question hung in the frozen air, a confession of their arrogance and their desperation. Anya looked from his face to the sheriff's, then back to the dark opening of the well. She said nothing. She simply turned, took hold of the rope, and began to pull up the wicker basket she used for collecting. The basket rose slowly from the depths, emerging from the darkness into the pale winter light. It was a moment of suspended reality. The four men watched, their breath held captive in their chests, a silent prayer on the lips of the faithless. As the basket cleared the stone lip of the well, they saw it. Nestled in the clean straw were 8 large, perfect duck eggs. They were still warm. A faint vapor rose from their smooth, pale shells, a sign of life and heat in a world that had seemingly frozen solid. The sight was so simple, so impossible, that it felt like a miracle. Anya lifted the basket and held it out. She didn't set a price. She didn't deliver a lecture. She simply offered the fruits of her faith, faith in her father's knowledge, in the earth's hidden warmth, and in her own quiet conviction. Sheriff Brody, a man not given to displays of emotion, let out a slow, shaky breath. He reached out and took an egg, its warmth a shocking, profound sensation against his frozen fingers. We'll pay you for these, he stammered. Whatever you ask, Anya shook her head gently. There will be more tomorrow, was all she said. The act of giving, freely and without recrimination, was more powerful than any sermon. It was a lesson in dignity, a quiet statement that compassion was not a currency to be traded for apologies. The men carried the eggs back to the town like a sacred offering. That night, for the first time since the storm, several families had a warm, protein-rich meal. The well, once a symbol of Anya's shame and isolation, had become the town's hearth, its source of sustenance. The winter that followed was long and hard, but Anya's ducks kept laying. Every morning, she would haul up a basket of warm eggs, a daily miracle from the deep earth. The townspeople, humbled and grateful, brought her what they could in trade: firewood, milled flour, salted pork, and mended clothes. They no longer saw her as the mad girl, but as their savior, a quiet young woman who possessed a wisdom far deeper than their own. They stopped calling her plot the punishment and began to refer to it simply as the well. It was no longer a place of judgment, but of hope. They learned from her, not just about the strange science of geothermal heat, but about the nature of value. They had seen a barren plot and a dry hole as worthless. She had seen a system, a sanctuary, a solution. She had looked beneath the surface of things, while they had only seen what was plain and obvious. Her father's journal, once the ramblings of an eccentric, was now understood as a text of profound practical knowledge. True wealth, they began to understand, was not always in the things you could easily see or count. Sometimes, it lay hidden in the deep, quiet places, in the knowledge that others had discarded, waiting for someone with the patience and the humility to listen. Anya had taught them that resilience is not always a fight. Sometimes, it is the wisdom to find warmth in a cold world, to seek shelter not by building thicker walls against the storm, but by understanding the gentle, constant breath of the earth itself. The hole in the ground had not been the end of her story. It had been the beginning of everyone else's.